Thank you all so much. Can you hear me okay? I have never spoken with flowers around my neck before, so this is a cross-cultural experience for me, for sure. It was a good one, good one. It's really good to be with all of you here today. I have met some of you. Some of you have already shared with me your name. I have to share something embarrassing. I am really bad at remembering names. So if I forget your name, it's not you, it's me, I promise. My wife is really good at remembering names, so she maybe will remember, but it's hard for me. God has a good sense of humor, doesn't he? So he says, okay, I'm going to make you a pastor. I'm also going to make it hard for you to remember people's names. And then I'm going to make you not just a pastor, but a pastor who travels around all over the country and has to meet new people all the time. And you still won't be good at remembering people's names. And that will keep you humble. Thank you, Lord. Right? It's good to be humbled. Eli already introduced us, so you know a little bit about us. We're originally from central Pennsylvania. We were privileged to be used by the Lord to start a church plant in State College, Pennsylvania. How many of you know where that is? Not very many. Penn State University. They're really good at losing, like football playoffs. You may have heard of them that way. So we were there for 6 years. And then we were asked by our denomination to go serve in East Asia, which we did. We thought we were going to be there for 20 years. We thought we'd be there forever. We had a medical situation that we had to leave. And in God's providence, it was just one of those ones that could not be maintained in East Asia. So then what? We ended up in Dayton, Ohio for about 4 years, which I understand we have some folks here who have family there. So we were talking even about our favorite zip codes, Huber Heights, Vandalia. And then at the end of 2023, our denomination asked if we would consider moving to Philadelphia, which is where our denomination's kind of offices are based, to help support church plants all over the United States and territories. And so we said, yes, we're happy to do that. For the sake of our conference here this weekend, I think the most important thing that you should know about me is that I'm not a natural extrovert. How many of you consider yourselves to be extroverts? All right. How many of you would say you're more introverted, right? Me, definitely. And so this conference where we're going to talk a lot about personal evangelism is, I mean, I'm sure the extroverts will learn some things, but y'all are already good at meeting people and talking to people. For those of us who are not naturally good at that, my hope is that the Lord will use what we're going to talk about to just encourage us and equip us and just move the needle a little bit and show us that this actually is possible. We can talk to people. It's still going to be challenging sometimes, but we can do it. We can talk to people about Jesus. And I think the Bible actually is going to give us a good model and a good paradigm to do that. And we're going to see that here in just a minute. How many of you have ever thought that unless you are sort of like super extroverted, you really can't be good at evangelism? Anybody ever thought that? I have. Let me ask you though, who was the greatest, what would you say, who was the greatest evangelist in the New Testament? Yeah, the Apostle Paul. Was the Apostle Paul an extroverted person? Why don't we listen to what Paul himself says? So you can just listen if you want, or you can look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2. In 1 Corinthians 2, verses 3 through 5, this is the Apostle Paul's own testimony about his time with the church in Corinth. Corinth was one of the churches that Paul planted on one of his missionary journeys. And this is what Paul says about himself. Paul says, 1 Corinthians 2, verses 3 through 5, I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my power, or my speech, and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Well, let me ask you, having heard his own words, do you think Paul was more extroverted or more introverted? It sounds like he was a little more introverted, right? And I want to encourage you to think that that is actually can be a great asset to evangelism. I have not been to the Costco here in Kapolei, but I have been to Costco's and Walmarts where I live on the East Coast of the United States. How many of you have ever gone into one of these big box stores and you're going in for maybe one or two things, but between you and the things you want to buy, there's somebody with like a pop-up sales booth. And they just have one question. And they're trying to sell you satellite TV or a new cell phone plan. Have any of you ever experienced that? Does that happen in Hawaii? It certainly happens in the continental U.S. And it's intrusive, it's frustrating, it's awkward. Now keep that in mind, keep that picture in your head. Now I want to give you another example. So years ago, right after we moved to Ohio, to Dayton, one of my friends from Huber Heights, actually, where your family lives, a friend of mine who lived in Huber Heights, Ohio, we were getting ready to go on vacation, and I said, I'm looking for a book to read on vacation. And he said, this is my absolute favorite sci-fi novel. It's my favorite series. I said, okay, I've never heard of it. I'll buy the first one and start reading it. And I start reading it, and I'm 100 pages in, and I decide I don't really like this book. But you know what? I like this guy. He's my friend. I trust him, so I keep going. 300 pages, 400 pages, 500 pages. I still don't like the book. 1,300 pages, I finish the book. And guess what? I still don't like it. But because I trusted the guy, I stuck with it and I heard it out, right? Let me ask you, which of those, the Costco guy or the trusted friend with a personal recommendation, what do you think was more effective at getting me to pay attention? The second, right? You don't need to be the Costco guy to share the gospel. If you can be the second person, the person who's a friend, the person who loves people, the person who will come alongside and said, this has meant a lot to me. Not a science fiction novel, though, but Jesus Christ. You can share your faith by sharing what the Lord has done for you. And the Lord is able to use even the most difficult stories as powerful tools for witness. If you will, turn with me. This is going to be sort of our paradigmatic text, our kind of our model. Turn with me to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5, this first section of Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, is one of the most vivid and even graphic stories in the New Testament. Not graphic in an inappropriate way, but just it's scary, it's visceral, it's gripping at you. The story of the man who was possessed by a legion of demons in the country of the Gerasenes. How many of you have read this story relatively recently? Okay, so Jesus gets out of the boat. We're going to paraphrase the first part of it for the sake of time. Jesus gets out of the boat, and we're told out of the tombs, a man comes and meets him. This man's been living among the places where they bury the dead. So it's already kind of graphic and eerie and kind of gloomy. And he meets Jesus, and Mark tells us that this is a man who's possessed by demons. Nobody can tie him up. Cords won't bind him. He breaks chains in pieces. And if you're tuned in to the kind of the big story of the Bible, you're going to start hearing echoes that this man, this demon-possessed man, he's like an anti-Samson. When the Old Testament talks about the story of Samson, it says these things can't bind him. He tears chains in pieces. He breaks bonds. So this demon-possessed man is like a satanic Samson. And he's always crying out. He's cutting himself. So it's very vivid. It's very graphic. And he starts running toward Jesus. And if you don't know the story, you might think he's going to do what? Like he's going to try to tackle Jesus, right? He's going to attack. But what ends up happening is he falls on his face before the Lord. And the Lord casts out the demon, says, you have to leave. What's your name? Well, there's many. We're a legion. How many soldiers were in a Roman legion? Does anybody know? Up to 6,000. Now, they weren't always full strength, but we do know that there was a herd of pigs numbering 2,000 that these demons went into and ran into the sea. So there were probably at least 2,000. Jesus casts the demons into the pigs. The pigs run down and they drown. The demons drown the pigs in the sea. The townspeople come out and they're terrified. Why are they terrified? Well, their local economy has just been completely trashed, right? And there might even be political implications because they may have been raising those pigs for the Roman army, who isn't going to believe that demons took the pigs and drowned them in the sea. So they're in trouble locally. The local economy is in trouble. There might be political trouble. So they ask Jesus to leave. Now that's where I want us to pick up and actually read the words of Mark. Let's look at starting in verse 17 through the end of the chapter. These are the townspeople. They began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. Now just pause there for a second and think, how many times in the Gospels is Jesus saying, "Follow me"? And people don't want to do it, right? Here we have the opposite. The man is begging, "I want to come with you." And what does the Lord say? Mark tells us he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he, the formerly demon-possessed man, he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis, that's just the local city, how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. Verse 19. Verse 19 is going to be our model for this time together this weekend. I think we see here a model for personal evangelism that has three pieces that not only worked in the first century, but they will work in our century. And they didn't just work in ancient Palestine, ancient Judea, ancient Decapolis. They will work in 21st century Oahu or anywhere. And that model is in verse 19. First of all, go home. Secondly, to your friends. Thirdly, tell them how much the Lord has done for you. Go home, be local, local focus. To your friends, be relational, focus on your natural connections. Thirdly, tell them how much the Lord has done for you. Be testimonial. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you. Was this model successful in the first century? Do you know the only other time Mark mentions the Decapolis, a few chapters later, when Jesus comes back to the Decapolis? People aren't asking him to leave. People are bringing people to him. This man who was sent back, we are told in verse 20, he went and proclaimed how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. This model is fruitful in the first century, and it will be fruitful in our own century. So go home, be local. Go to your friends, be relational. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you. Be testimonial, be personal. Let's start then, and we've got about a half hour to our break. Let's talk about the first piece, be local. When he says go home, he's implying something a little more than just go to your address. When we talk about a home, we don't just mean the place where I park my car, right? What else do we do in homes? It's a place where we have connection. It's a place where we have family. And even if you've moved around a lot, how many of you have moved at least 3 times in your life? How many of you have moved at least 5 times in your life? All right, 10 times? Still a couple? More than 10? Okay, so there's just 1 or 2. You know that it's hard to move home because home is not just a matter of your address. It's a matter of your connections. It's a matter of your local culture, your context. And so when Jesus says go home, he's not just saying go to a place where you sleep at night. He's implying that we should have some awareness of the place in which we live, of the times in which we live. Elsewhere in the Gospels, in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus says, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves, so be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. In the Old Testament, in the book of Chronicles, it talked about men of wisdom who understood the times. And so for us to truly be local, to have a local focus in evangelism, it does mean geography, but it means more than geography. It means having some awareness of our surrounding culture and how it thinks and how it works, and even the big ideas or the background assumptions that control our culture or that are informing our culture. How many of you know when I say a background assumption, what do I mean? What is an assumption? Who can give me, just shout it out. What's an assumption? As a Presbyterian congregation, like nobody wants to talk. Okay. I should warn you, I've taught junior high Sunday school. I will call on people if no one answers. Assuming, right? It's something that you bring to a conversation, right? It's something that's working in the background. You might not be thinking about it, but it's there. So not just people have assumptions, but cultures have assumptions that like everybody grows up with. Our culture has assumptions. And I know maybe it's a little generalizing to say our culture. Of course, the United States is a big country. Hawaii is not the same as the mainland. California is not the same as Pennsylvania, where I grew up. But there are some background assumptions that sort of hit all places, I think. And when I was a child, there were some background assumptions that really worked in favor of Christianity. And I'm only 45 years old, but over the course of my lifetime, I've seen this change. When I was a kid, it was still the case that most people, maybe not 100%, but most people that you would meet or that I would meet just in daily life, most people, if you ask them where did the universe come from, they would probably say, well, there's probably a God out there that created it. Probably. Most people. And if you believe that there is a God who made the universe, then that tells you that the universe has a sort of fixed order, right? If it was designed, it was designed a certain way. That's true of anything that's built, right? Your smartphone is designed by Apple or by Samsung or by whomever, and it's designed to work a certain way. If you believe that the universe was made by God, even if you're not really clear on who God is, if you believe that there is a God who made the universe, then that's going to imply that the universe was made in a certain way, with certain fixed rules, certain fixed laws, certain fixed purpose. Like there's a meaning to life. You guys tracking with me so far? And if you believe that there's sort of a fixed meaning to the universe, that it was built a certain way, then that tells us something about what human life is really about. If the universe is designed by God with a fixed purpose, then the good life, the good human life, is going to consist in discovering that purpose that the universe is wired with and then trying to harmonize with it. Now, different perspectives on what that might be, different religions that would all say they believe in God, they would have different arguments about that idea of what that purpose is. But that background assumption that the universe was built by God with a fixed purpose, Christians believe that too. And so those background assumptions that worked in society were very helpful for Christian evangelism. Can you understand why? You just tell people, well, you're really not living according to God's way of life. Oh, yeah, maybe you're right. Even when I was a kid, people that I went to school with who maybe didn't go to church, there was a little bit of guilt in that. Not a lot, but there was a little bit of guilt, like, yeah, my family doesn't go to church. Because there was at least a background cultural assumption that we were made by God and we were made for God. And therefore, we ought to live to God. That's the world I grew up in. How many of you grew up in something similar? Yes? No? Maybe? Yeah, okay, so a couple of us at least. In my own lifetime, that has changed. And the background assumption that's sort of informing our culture is no longer that the universe was made by God with a fixed purpose, but rather the opposite, that the universe was not made by God, that the universe is an accident, and that the universe that we see has no real fixed purpose, but it's fluid. The purpose is fluid. There might be physical laws that are fixed, but in terms of moral categories or ethical purpose or meaning, there is none. Because there's no creator, there's no ultimate design. Because the universe is ultimately some sort of cosmic accident, there's really no built-in purpose. How many of you have heard this in school or in class, right? If you believe that changes what you think about the purpose of human life. If there is no fixed purpose, no greater story out there for you to find and join, then what's the only alternative if you're a human being? Make up your own. Make up your own story. Make up your own standards. And that's now the background assumption that is informing. That's one of the big assumptions that is informing our culture. We see it on the east coast of the mainland. I know you see it in Southern California. I bet you see it here in Hawaii as well, right? Right. This is one of those big assumptions. So in my lifetime, we've gone from sort of this fixed view to a fluid view. And one of the things that has really sort of enabled that or made that believable is just the rapid advance of technology in our own lifetime. And when I was a kid, when I was as young as some of the kids that are here with us today, computers were these big, ugly boxes. Storage on a computer were these big, kind of square, flat things. Have you ever seen the save button on Microsoft Word? They actually had models of those that you put in the computers and you save things on them. And now there's more power in the phone that's in my pocket, like 20 times more power than in any of those machines. And so as technology has advanced, not just computer technology, but medical technology, mechanical technology, electronics, it has given fuel to the idea that we can change reality. We can shape reality. Reality is what we say it is, not what God says it is. And so the background assumption has changed. And as background assumptions change, guess what else changes? Your core values. When a society or an individual's background assumptions change, the core values change as well. And so when I was a kid and when my parents were children and when my grandparents were children, sort of one of the great core values of our society, of the society in which they grew up, was religious liberty and having the freedom to follow the truth. That the idea was there was this fixed truth and you could discover it and they wanted to protect the freedom to follow it. But now that the background assumption has changed, we're no longer talking about a God-centered view of the universe because the background assumption is what? There is no God. If there is no God, there's no truth to follow. Truth is what you make. Truth is what you decide. Your core value is no longer going to be religious liberty. The core value is now going to be individual self-expression. And how many of us can just say we see this all around us, right? That so many of our friends, family, people we love and care for, like their goal in life is just to express themselves. It's all about finding your happiness. In fact, the place where I live, Pennsylvania, we've had many state mottos over the year. Every so often they change our state motto. We have the most idiotic state motto now in Pennsylvania: pursue your happiness. But it embodies that view. It embodies that assumption. That happiness and thriving is something that you define. And so they say, come to Pennsylvania, define your happiness and pursue it. This is the world in which we live. Why is that important for us to know as we think about evangelism? It's not just like a philosophy lecture. The reason it's important is because it helps us understand what to expect. It helps us to understand the people that we're going to engage with. Right? We want to be wise as serpents, gentle as doves. And understanding the background assumptions that feed into people's stories are going to help us to be wise and to be gentle. So if we have gone from a fixed view of the universe, where the core value was to find the truth and pursue it, to a fluid view of reality, where the core value is to find your own truth and express yourself, what is that going to tell us? It's going to tell us some things about what to expect. First of all, the most fundamental human right, under the new way of thinking, under the fluid view of reality, the most fundamental human right is the right to individual self-expression. I've already said that, but that comes then with an important consequence. If my most fundamental right is to express myself individually, you must respect that. And not just respect that, you must affirm that. And so under this current world in which we live, we should expect people to demand affirmation. And don't we see that again in the world around us now? People have all sorts of opinions, and they're living in ways that are very contrary to the way Jesus says we are to live. And when you say that's wrong, they say, you should affirm me. If you don't affirm me, you are not just disagreeing. If you don't affirm me, you are violating my fundamental human right, my right to self-expression. And therefore, refusing to affirm me in my chosen course of life is really a crime against my humanity. And that has led to a culture where disagreement on certain issues is no longer tolerated. Disagreement must be canceled. Disagreement must be squelched. Have you seen this? You've seen this in the news, seen this on social media? The reason is because those background assumptions have changed. Because the greatest core value is no longer to pursue the truth, capital T. The background assumption is that I should be able to choose my own truth and express myself. So ideas have consequences. They flow downstream. And so as we go out to evangelize, you should expect that there are going to be times when you talk to people about Jesus and they're going to get mad. Because even when you're gentle, even when you're gracious, if you really present somebody with the truth that Jesus is Lord, and he is, that's going to mean somebody else that they're very attached to is not Lord. Who is that person? Myself. To say that Jesus is Lord is to say that I am not. And if I have built my life around that background assumption that I am the most important thing, that I do define truth, that my individual self-expression is the great purpose of my life, and along come this Christian person with the gentlest, humblest, most gracious approach, but they still point out to me that Jesus is Lord and I am not, I am going to be offended. And we can even sympathize, can't we? I mean, if somebody makes fun of Jesus, do you get happy or do you get upset? I get upset, right? Because Jesus is my God, and he's so good. If you come along and offend somebody else's God, even if it's the God that they see in the mirror every morning, they're going to get upset. We still have to do it, but we can sympathize. Of course you're upset. And you can even say, we'll talk about this in our next talk, you can even say things like, look, I'm not trying to upset you, but what I have to say might be a little upsetting. And that's why. Because all of us are religious, whether we want to, all people, everybody on this island is religious, intrinsically so. God made us for ourselves. Our hearts are restless till they rest in him. And if we are not serving the Creator, the book of Romans says we are serving the creature. That could be an idol that you worship in a temple on a hill. It could be an idol that you look at in the mirror. But all of us are religious. So all people are all the time craving meaning, craving purpose, craving community, craving ways to connect to God. But if they're not worshiping Jesus, they're worshiping themselves or something else, and it will create conflict. Now that's challenging, but there's also good news in the midst of all of this. And I want to leave some time for questions, so we're going to have to move quickly through some of the rest of the material I have. But I want to leave you with some encouragements before we pause, okay? How many of you have heard, when people talk about religion, how many of you have heard the category none, N-O-N-E-S? You know, I'm none. What does that mean? Who can tell me? It doesn't necessarily mean they're not spiritual, but it does mean they have no what? Not necessarily, although that's a good guess. No, it's a good guess. No, they don't identify with any institutional religion, right? They might say I'm spiritual but not religious. I'm none. I'm not affiliated. I don't identify as a Christian. I don't identify as a Buddhist or a Muslim or anything. I don't identify with anything. I'm a none. Now, what's really interesting about that category, there's a lady in our church in Philadelphia. She works for the American Bible Society. They do all sorts of research and surveys. She gave me a copy of their 2024 research. And in that research, they have statistically shown that 35% of people who identify as nuns still say they are either personally committed to Jesus or curious about the Bible. Does that surprise you? It surprised me when I read that. Now you might say, how could they say they're personally committed to Jesus but not religious? I don't know. I'd love to find out. I'd love to talk to them about that. But even of the people out there that you might be most inclined to write off, people that say, I'm not religious, research shows that more than 1 out of 3 are at least interested to know something about the Bible. And some of them even think they're committed to Jesus. Isn't that encouraging? That means there are people out there that we can have conversations with, even in this culture of affirmation. Other good news. Being in a position of weakness for the church in terms of cultural power is globally and historically normal. Okay, it's different. Like in the United States, at least in in North American culture from the time of my grandparents and from the beginning of the United States, Christians always had a seat at the table. They were always influential. But you have to understand that globally speaking today, and historically speaking throughout the history of the world, that is so weird. Most of the time in history, and most places around the world today, Christians are not powerful. Christians are not the cultural influencers. Being in the cultural influential minority is globally and historically normal for Christians. And it is usually the place where Christianity thrives, where evangelism thrives. This was true in the time of the ancient church, and it's true today. Let me give you just two quick examples, and then we'll pause. In the early church, from the time of the Emperor Nero to the time of the Emperor Constantine, about 250 years, things were really hard for Christians. Sometimes persecution was local, sometimes it was empire-wide. It got so bad that at certain times and places, the churches would actually close their worship services to outsiders. I'm not saying that was a good thing. I'm saying that happened. They were concerned about informers coming in and ratting them out, or people finding out that they were there, and so they would just close down. They would even have like deacons standing outside, and they would turn people away if they weren't known, recognized. And yet, during that same period of time, when church was hard and many churches were underground, literally or figuratively, the church was exploding evangelistically. If you have a study Bible and you look at the back and all those maps, how many of you have a Bible with like 20 maps in the back? Usually one of them is like the expansion of Christianity in the first 3 centuries. And you'll see, evangelistically, the church is exploding. In a time of cultural hostility, evangelism thrives. Another example from more recent church history, in 1950, when all the foreign missionaries were kicked out of the country of China, the best research, the best data says there might have been about 1 million Christians there in 1950. It's about 75 years later now. You can't get accurate statistics on the number of Christians because they have to be underground, many of them. But estimates are somewhere between 60 to 100 million Christians in China today. That means for every year of a hostile government, 1 million new people have become Christians. And so being in a cultural minority or not being in power doesn't mean the gospel doesn't go forward. In fact, the data seems to suggest the opposite. Times of cultural hostility are actually times when evangelism can be very fruitful. Why? Because it makes the contrast clearer. If everybody is a Christian, nobody will think twice about it. And if you look at so-called Christian societies in the past, you'll find that not long after the society becomes so-called Christian, people stop caring about Jesus. They just assume they're going to heaven. They assume everything's right with their society. And so they take their foot off the gas, spiritually, so to speak. But when going to church could cost you your job, could cost you your family, could put you in prison, you're going to take that seriously. And so in a time of cultural hostility, it's not comfortable, but it is an opportunity where the contrast and the opportunity space for real evangelism, telling people what Jesus means to us in real terms, has more potential than ever before. And so I grew up in a place that was maybe more outwardly Christian, but we are living in a time now where there's maybe in our lifetimes there has never been a better opportunity for evangelism than today, right now. Not in spite of the cultural hostility, but really because of it. The gospel thrives in times whenever the contrast matters. Does that make sense? All right, I'm going to pause now because we'll take a break at 4, but we have about 10 minutes. The next talk we're going to get really practical. How do we actually interact with people? But I thought it was important to kind of lay the groundwork, help us understand the world that we're stepping into, not to whine about it, but to understand it. All right, any questions or comments? Pastor Eli. Yes, I will do that. Yep. Mm-hmm. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to repeat the question so people in the live stream can hear. So the question was, if our work environments may be hostile to sharing the gospel, should we share the gospel at a work environment? I think the commandments of Jesus really help us here, right? Thou shalt not steal includes thou shalt not steal time from thine employer, actually, I think. Um, so in a work environment, I've had colleagues. I'll tell you a story about one of them later. I had a colleague that I shared the gospel with, but importantly, it wasn't very often at work. Now, maybe if we're walking to get coffee, like on a break, that might be an opportunity. But I shouldn't be spending time where my employer is paying me to work on something, evangelizing. If I get yelled at for that, that's not persecution. That's appropriate corporate discipline. Does that make sense? That's a great question. I really appreciate that question. Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Uh-huh. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Let me repeat the question. So Sage was asking, if you come across a person who says, I'm a follower of Jesus, but not a Christian, how would you respond? I, my first thing would be, that's really interesting. I mean, that is genuinely interesting to me, right? I'm not using interesting in scare quotes. Like, that's really interesting. Can you just help me understand what that means? Help me understand is a really good way to talk to somebody. Like, I honestly don't, I've never, that seems impossible to me, but it's obviously something that's possible for you because you explained that to me. Help me understand. I'm really interested in this. That would be my first step, and then just see where it goes. It could be that they have church hurt, and so they think that being a Christian means being in a community where they had a really bad experience, and so they're still captivated by Jesus, but they've been really hurt by the church. That's one possibility, and there are others, or myriads of possibilities. But that's where I would start. Just hey, help me understand. Very interested. That's a great question. I've met people like that too. Yeah. Any other questions or comments at this point? Yes, sir. Yeah. So the question was overseas in places like East Asia. Um, are there differences in sort of the background assumptions and how that affects your approach? I think that modern Chinese society, of course, they don't have a long period of Christian influence the way U.S. society does. So there's differences there. In terms of the way things kind of operate now on the streets, when I was teaching English, and I asked my students, if you could have three wishes, what would you choose? And almost all of them said the same three wishes. They would say, I'd want to be rich, I want good health for myself and my family, and I'd like to be able to travel. That's not that much different from the functional assumptions and goals of most people in the United States, right? At least the first two. If you asked an average American, like, if I could give you three wishes, what would you want? I'd like a million wishes. Well, you can't have a million wishes, right? If you're going to get three, I want to be rich, I want to live forever, and then who knows? The third thing might differ. So the assumptions were somewhat the same, but at times there were still times where, and I didn't know a lot about, I was the culture, still learning the culture, but there were certain things that would resonate more um, in Asian society than maybe in the U.S. One time we were talking about sin and trying to help people understand that sin, even if you're a good citizen, if you don't acknowledge God, you're sinning. And so I was able to say to one of my friends in East Asia, it's important to honor your parents, right? Which is a big thing in that society. I said, now imagine a person who they were really a good employee. They were generous to their neighbors. They take care of their kids, their spouse, but they never talk to their parents. They don't even acknowledge that their parents helped them at all. would you say that person is a good person? And they said, no, there's a problem with that person. They show no respect for their parents. I said, that's how it is if we don't acknowledge God. So sometimes those sort of more particular cultural resonances, you can adapt or touch that, right? Whereas I don't know that that particular example would work as well in North America. It would work a little, but not as well. So, does that answer your question? Yeah, really good question. Other questions, comments? Yes, sir. Question was, do I find open air evangelism effective? I'm going to half answer that, and then I'm going to punt for the next session. So the half answer is I've done it, and I've seen some fruit. But I want to save a bigger answer on that to the next session, because I actually will address that. Okay? But thank you for that question.